How's it going, guys? John, the basic expert here. Back on October 28th, I shot out a tweet asking, explain below, reply to this tweet below about why you hate 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. And I tried to compile a list of everything, and honestly, I got like over 100 responses. A lot of them are repeating, so I kind of just want to go over. I have on my phone here, I copied down some of the biggest complaints that I saw, and I kind of wanted to talk about it because I wanted to kind of talk about 5e again. I haven't talked about it in a while, and I think it's not because just like 2024 is out. I said in the video last week, I was at Barnes & Noble, and they had at least the player's book and the Dungeon Master's Guide there. And I kind of flipped through them. They're not very interesting to me. I'm not really interested in getting those, but obviously. But I do have fond memories still of running 5th edition. And while I don't think that 5th edition is by any means the greatest edition that's ever existed of the game, I think probably the most interesting and one that kind of scratches all the itches, at least for me, is probably 1st edition or 0e if you're trying to implement chainmail. But 5th edition, I think, is one of those games where I hated on it. It's cool and popular to hate on it, you know. But does it deserve really all the hate that it gets? And is it the game? Are the complaints that people have really something that's a problem that's within the rules themselves, or are they other things that maybe can't be dealt with? So I want to start with, I think, a legit complaint about 5th edition. And it's a complaint that I have. It's a big complaint that I have. And it's something that someone said in the list here, which was, the binding on the books is trash, definitely won't stand the test of time. That was one I saw, and I was actually glad to see that criticism in there, because here's my player's handbook. And this thing, as you can see, is totally fallen apart. The binding is just atrocious. They did do it. That's a legit criticism, and I have a feeling, for those of you that are maybe considering 2024, you're probably going to have the same binding issues. I have my 1st edition books on here, and like, let's look at the one that's the worst. My player's handbook is like in the worst condition. I got this used, and it smells like a little bit moldy. The pages inside are a little discolored, but the binding is holding up pretty good still. Can't complain. Hasn't fallen apart. My DMG. My DMG is like, I mean, obviously it has some bumps and bruises, and there's some stains on pages and things like that. But all in all, this thing is like in very pristine condition. And the binding is holding up great. And I don't know what Wizards of the Coast excuse is for the 5th edition books that are just atrocious. And so like this book is falling apart, and then you're going to see here with my monster manual, I have a comb binder. I actually had to use a comb binder and take this because every single page of my monster manual fell out. Every single one. So now I have this, in this version, in this way here, it works just the same. But as you can see, I had to rebind this myself. It's almost like too big. Whatever. Go over there. So I think that's a legitimate complaint, that the binding doesn't last. Because for me, I wasn't abusive to my books. I'm not abusive to my books. They simply lay flat on the table in front of me as we're playing the game, and they lay flat in front of the players if it's a player's handbook during the game. So there's nothing that's being done to these books that is overly abusive to them. I'm not hawking them down the stairs or something like that, right? Like, they're being used as books are supposed to be used, and they couldn't even survive that. The only book that survived and been in good condition is my Dungeon Master's Guide, my 5e Dungeon Master's Guide, which is the only book I have that's kind of held it together. I don't know what they did on this book that helped it stay bound together better, but man, it's pretty atrocious, the quality of the book. So I agree with that criticism. I want to get to the other criticism that I heard that was sort of very common that I saw, and this is one where I'm kind of iffy on, because I don't think that this is necessarily a problem of the rules themselves, of the game itself. It's maybe a problem, well, it is a problem for Wizards of the Coast and how they marketed the game, who they've marketed the game to, and how. It's a problem with the culture that after it's been marketed to these kinds of people, how that culture has devolved and changed the game as this like sort of unholy feedback loop. But lots of people complained about the culture around 5e, from low information players that don't know the rules to terrible homebrews to I just hate how woke WotC is. I hate XYZ about Wizards of the Coast. I hate Matt Mercer. I hate so-and-so. I hate actual plays. I just hate everything and the people that like this game. And I get it, but at the same time, the game wasn't always like that. When I picked up the game in 2014, they weren't marketing the game like that. So, and I want to preface this by saying I'm just trying to look at this objectively and fairly, right? Like I'm not trying to do a hit piece on 5e. I'm not trying to be super pro 5e. I'm trying to look at this in an objective way that's not hyper emotional from one side or another. So I want to get that out there as well. But this complaint seems like something where it's not necessarily the rules' fault. Like there's no game design element necessarily that means that the culture has to be the way that it is. I've mentioned before that I have a player in my in-person group who started in 5e. He has really no online presence beyond like a Facebook page. He doesn't really spend much time online because he's an adult with a job and like 5 kids, so he doesn't care. And so when I told him about how woke WotC was, he's like, what? Like, I didn't even know, you know? So like, there's a segment of the hobby out there that sees 5th edition and just sees it as like heroic high fantasy gaming, right? That's how he saw it. That's how he plays it and played it. And so there's plenty of people out there that are just like unaware of the stuff that is going on, that this is a complaint about. And I would say, in my experience at least, and maybe it's where I live, but I don't think that the people that seems, it doesn't seem to be as black and white in person. The online space is for sure a toxic culture in general. I think with role-playing games, just in general, and this goes for the not woke side and the woke side. Both elements of the culture are extremely, I don't want to use the word, I hate the word toxic. I shouldn't use that word, but they're both not fun to be in sometimes. You know, I've talked about this as on my end, where I look at older editions and I talk about rules or ideas or methods of play that I think are derived from rules as written. Raw, that's something that gets everyone pissed off. Doesn't matter if you're woke or not woke. They will all turn on you and try and destroy you and kill you and tell you you're a really bad person and you're bad for the hobby because you mentioned the horrible words of rules as written. So there's that. And that's not just in 5e. That's in, again, across the whole hobby. But so to me, it's like the culture thing isn't a big deal. And honestly, when I look at like the complaint about homebrew, when I see that, a lot of the guys are BX guys or like 2nd edition D&D guys who honestly, you guys run BX and you run 2E and even 1E, even 0E, the same way that the 5E nerds do in a lot of respects. You know, hand wave rules, you have cringe homebrew, you do all kinds of stuff like that where it's sort of like, do you really want to be throwing, I've mentioned this before, are you really the person to be throwing stones in a glass house? And so there's that side. I think the culture thing is a legitimate gripe, but it's something, in my opinion, that is easily avoidable by gatekeeping your table and gatekeeping the content that you have at your table. Maybe you just want to stick to the core 2014 rulebooks, and you're probably going to have a good time doing that. You don't need all the extra stuff, Radiant Citadel nonsense, or the later supplements that sort of really break classes and whatnot. Other things that I saw before I get to some points about actual material and content that I want to address, I saw lots of contradictory complaints. I saw people complaining both that it was too easy, but also that the game is well, not that it's too easy. I got complaints that it was not complex enough and that the game is too complex. And so it's sort of like, which is it, right? Like, which way are we going here? Because it can't be both. Objectively, it cannot be both. Maybe, so it's totally like a personal preference thing. And I think that right there kind of shows maybe this is a flaw of 5e, because some of the people mentioned this as well, that it tries to be everything to everyone, and therefore it's not really good at any one thing. But I would argue that it's not really bad at any one thing. It's not like it's atrocious. It's not like it utterly fails completely and is unplayable in any respect either. So I would put that complaint as a justification or as an observation that 5th edition is a game that is mediocre. That's fine. Mediocre games are fine. I write some mediocre games myself. It's mediocre. It's sort of, it's good at what it's good enough at what it does. You can play it and have fun. And really, I mean, at the end of the day, that's kind of a nice thing to have. And I think even looking back at 2014 when these came out and seeing the game, and maybe you didn't like it then, but if you look at the game now, or you look at 2024, you're like, oh, we didn't know what we had. Like, I would gladly go back to them just releasing a game that is good enough, right? Instead of 2024 looks like it doubles down in all the wrong ways on the things that we don't like about 5th edition, or at least a lot of what people are talking about they don't like. So let's get into some of the other things that people talked about. So one thing was combat is slow, individual initiative and move action bonus, action reaction for each. I want to, let's look at this because I marked this stuff out. Someone also mentioned like 5e combat is incredibly slow unless you homebrew and use side initiative. And I want to say that actually using side initiative in 5e is not homebrew because 270 of the DMG, you have rules for initiative variants, and one of those is side initiative, where you just roll a d20 for either side. So it's very similar to the old school method of rolling a d6 for either side. It's literally in the rules. And I think we're going to come and see, as we dive through some of these complaints, that some of these complaints kind of tattle on people, that you wouldn't have these complaints about 5e if you had just read your book. Don't Ginny D this and wait 10 years to read it, right? Actually read your book. One other complaint that I saw was, let me go to this page here that I have marked off. I had lots of complaints in the replies about it's too easy. It's too rests were a big thing that people complained about. Well, on page 267 of said DMG, you have rules for gritty realism. It says this variant on rests is the rest variant rule. This variant uses short rests for 8 hours and a long rest for 7 days. This puts the brakes on the campaign, requiring the players to carefully judge the benefits and drawbacks of combat. Characters can't afford to engage in too many battles in a row, and all adventuring requires careful planning. This approach encourages the characters to spend time out of the dungeon. It's a good option for campaigns that emphasize intrigue, politics, and interactions among other NPCs, and in which combat is rare or something to be avoided rather than rushed into. I think that the way they're selling it is just dumb, because it's really just like it's closer to like an old school feel. So if you want to run a resource management dungeon delve, use the gritty realism rule on page 267 of the DMG. If you're running 5e, and your complaints about long rests and short rests are solved. It's as simple as that. So, well, another complaint that I saw quite frequently in that same realm was hit point bloat, and that it's too easy for players. A lot of people complain about death saves, that death saves kind of create this whack-a-mole game. And I think there's a way to actually, well, again, in the rules, that sort of show how to fix that. On page 272, it has lingering injuries, and some of these force saving throws and cause permanent effects to the characters, like losing an eye, lose an arm or a hand, lose a foot or a leg, limp, internal injury, broken ribs, horrible scar, festering wound, minor scar. And you roll a d20 when a character, it says, Takes a critical hit when it drops to 0 hit points but isn't killed outright when it fails a death saving throw by 5 or more. And I think you could even change this to be like, you make any death saving throws if you wanted to. You use the lingering injuries table on page 272 of the DMG. And finally, one thing that I think I saw a lot of was people complaining about lack of wilderness rules. And I just want to say that this might be somewhat of a both and. This might be something where you have a legitimate gripe about 5th edition here because the way that it explains it, it has you doing it doesn't explicitly lay out the procedure for wilderness adventure, but the rules are there for doing it. Now, it might not be as robust as 1E's DMG, where it has hex generation, although this does have a dungeon generator in it, which one of the complaints I saw is it doesn't have rules for dungeon delving. It literally has a 1E style dungeon generator in this thing in the back, in one of the appendices. So, but for wilderness mapping, it's kind of all over the place, and I don't want this video to be overly long explaining that, but I did find a Reddit thread that Malachi shared on the Guilded server that kind of explains the mechanics or the procedure for using 5th edition to generate hexes, and it gives you page numbers in the core rulebooks and all that kind of good stuff. I will link to the thread below because it answers that criticism as well. Some of the other ones I heard was like everything is magical, monsters are nerfed. Let's talk about the monsters are nerfed one for a bit here. One thing I know for myself as a DM, at least especially in my early days when I started in 4th edition and I made the switch to 5th, and then after I got sick of 5th, I went to like BX and AD&D and all the old school editions, right? That was my journey to old school. But when I was running 5e, and even when I was running 4e, I noticed that, I think this is a greater tendency for many modern DMs, this pitfall that I had. I think it's more common for modern DMs than it is for the other way, was I was always too easy on my players. I would look at monster abilities and I would be like, oh, I don't know about that. And that brings me to this other point here. I wanted to share one other thing here, actually. Sorry. On the massive damage front. So this is kind of into the monsters part. Because some of the monsters, if they land one hit, they can deal lots of damage, right? So you can have this massive damage roll on page 273. Notice all these things are together in the DMG. It's like people just didn't read this section of the 5e DMG. It says, this optional rule makes it easier for a creature to be felled by massive damage. When a creature takes damage from a single source equal to or greater than half its hit point maximum, it must succeed on a DC 15 Constitution saving throw or suffer a random effect determined by a roll on the system shock table, which is below. For example, a creature that has a hit point maximum of 30 must make the Constitution save if it takes 15 damage or more from a single source. And you roll a d10, and on a roll of 1, the creature drops to 0 hit points. 2 to 3, the creature drops to 0 hit points but is stable. 4 to 5, the creature is stunned until the end of its next turn. 6 to 7, the creature can't take reactions and has disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks until the end of the next turn. And 8 to 10, the creature can't take reactions until the end of its next turn. This right here, if you play monsters smartly, because obviously you're going to have this against the monsters, but if you play monsters smartly and intelligently, you should be able to screw up the action economy, and this should be your goal as a dungeon master in 5th edition, using monster abilities, monster attacks, ambushes, things like that, to screw up their action economy. Because if you know that that's a problem, if you know that I have this single dragon, and this single dragon isn't going to survive against the party because of its action economy of the game, right? We can admit that that's a broken thing. It just means you need to play smarter. You need to be a bit more evil. Stop being so nice. So what I was saying before is, one of the things, I would just be too nice as a GM. I wouldn't use an ability. I wouldn't. I would pull punches with a monster. I would avoid playing the monster as intelligent and evil when I should be playing it as intelligent and evil. And that's the way you're going to absolutely give a challenge to your 5th edition players. So I think the massive damage rule on page 273, like, this is going to apply to the monster itself, but it's also going to apply to the players. This also solves another problem I saw frequently in my replies to this comment, which was, or to my posts on Twitter, on X, that combat takes too long. Well, now, if they take more than half of their damage in a single attack, or from a single source, as the rules say, I guess you could interpret that out how you will, they have to make that roll and determine what happens to it, which could mean it falls to 0 hit points, or it falls to 0 hit points and stable, or it's going to lose a reaction, so on and so. You screw up the monster's action economy, but this also means that the player's action economy can be screwed up as well, and that instantly changes the dynamics of combat, right? Players are going to have to be smarter now. And now this is a war game. This is a game of wits, of monsters versus players, which I think is way more interesting than what I think a lot of people are doing and have done for the last 10 years with 5th edition, is just make this like an HP bloat slugfest. And that's not the game's fault. It gives you the tools in here to not have that happen. If you're not using that, that's not the game's fault. So I did that tweet. I wanted to make this video because I kind of suspected that this would be what would happen. This would be the response that I would get from a lot of people. And I don't blame people, because it's sort of become a meme at this point to hate on 5e. And I don't think anyone's actually cracked open their rulebooks in a while. And quite honestly, Wizards of the Coast doesn't really give you an incentive to do that, unfortunately, with their behavior. They don't crack open the rule books, they don't read the rules, and this has been a problem since the very beginning of the hobby. It shouldn't be surprising to us that people have complaints about problems that are self-created because they don't read the rules. And I'm not trying to be mean to people in my replies, but I just wanted to make this video to provide some perspective, because I think that there is a potential for a good game to be buried within 5e, and I've seen it. I've seen it with Adventures in Middle-earth, which I've always spoken very highly of. I think it's the best version of 5e that there is out there. I know people love Symbaroum. I know people really love Brancolonia. I love Brancolonia. Those are great versions of 5e, right? So there's a good game that's buried within the 5th edition rules that is completely possible to play, and in a lot of respects can have a lot of old school feels to it while still being 5th edition, and it's given to you in the rulebook. So I think that 5e does have some justification for being disliked, right? It does have this sort of mass appeal thing. It wants to be this gray goo in a lot of respect. Some people complained about the art in 5e, and I think 5e, the core rulebooks, most of the art is like, So there's some really good pieces. Like Ralph Horsley did some pieces in there that are fantastic. He's one of my favorite artists. But there's some pieces like that halfling playing the mandolin that are absolutely an abomination. There's the monster manual art is sort of like, it's not very inspiring. But that to me isn't a big deal. Traveler doesn't have any art in it at all. And I love Traveler. I love classic Traveler. Where I'm going with this, though, is I think that we're a little bit overly harsh on this, and I think that it means we can't actually have a good discussion about 5th edition. We can't actually critique it for what it actually is, because it's the vision of it, the view of it has been so convoluted that, you know, we can't actually be objective about it. And that's what I'm trying to do in this video. So I probably made a bunch of people mad. They're going to be like, John's an apologist for 5e. I'm not. This is still not my favorite game. But I do think that it is a mediocre game. It's an okay game. And if you're playing 5e, you shouldn't feel bad. And don't let other people feel bad for you playing it. I think that some of the things and the tools that we need, like the wilderness rules, are buried, and you have to jump around, and we live in a world where people don't read books clearly, so those things just get missed, right? And that's partly the book's layout, not necessarily the rules, because the rules are there. That's a layout problem in the book. But other things like culture, marketing, those are things that are kind of exterior to the books themselves. And I do think that we can judge the company and the game on those things, right? If the marketing is weird, and if the marketing is sketchy, if the marketing is a bit like, I don't know about that, like that's an understandable skepticism that I see. Understandable, I want to keep this at arm's length sort of feeling that I totally understand. But again, I still just want us to be objective. So what do you think about my response to a lot of this? I'd love to know in the comments below. And this isn't going to fix every problem. Again, I'm not saying that 5e is awesome. I'm not saying it's the greatest game ever. I'm just saying it's mediocre, and it's not this train wreck that people like to sort of portray it as. So sound off in the comments below. I mean, 2024 will probably be that, no doubt. I don't see the point of this new edition. It seems, again, like I looked at it at Barnes & Noble the other day when I flipped through it, and I'm like, I'm not interested in this. But the 2014 one, I think, will be pretty well remembered. It will be the 3.5 of a whole generation. It will be the second edition of a whole generation, right? There are people still playing 3.5 today. There's people still playing 2e today, right? These are well-beloved editions for a reason. And same with first edition and with BX, you know. So I just don't, I want to, I'd love to have a conversation about 5th edition, but I'd love to have a conversation about it in an objective manner that's not fueled by just like, it's cool to hate on 5e, but, you know, we can actually have constructive criticism about the game, because that's how we can actually make the game better, if we're going to write stuff for it, or if we're going to run it. You know, I know plenty of GMs and referees that, you know, their players are only familiar with 5e, and maybe they like 5e, and they're just looking to make their 5e games better. I would say read your DMG. You know, it's going to solve most of the problems that you have or are experiencing with 5e. So that's going to do it for this video, guys. Check out Muckweasel, check out Atomic Punk. Those are hopefully soon available, at least for Atomic Punk in hardcover at this point. If not, it will be soon. Muckweasel is for sale on my website, and link will be below in the pinned comment. And thank you guys for watching. If you want to support the channel, you can support right here on YouTube by being a channel member. You can do it on Subscribestar, or you can join my Guilded server, which is a really cool place where we talk about games, and you can support monetarily there as well. Helps pay for StreamYard, helps pay for gear, helps me devote more time to this, to making content for you guys that is hopefully interesting and informative about this hobby that we love. So until the next video, guys, I'll talk to you later. Peace out.